everyone. It's so nice to connect with you again for this installation of our Eastertide Formation series, Rule of Life, Living Life with Intention. So just to reflect with you on where we've been, we've discussed the goal of a rule of life, the intention behind a rule of life, to reflect on who God is calling you to be and to provide the structure and the encouragement and the guidance that will help move you forward into that space that God is calling you to. And the foundational work of listening, the importance of attuning ourselves to the voice of God in our very midst. And then moving from that to contemplating who God might be calling you into being and how you might move into that space. And this week, we're contemplating together vulnerability. This is the third of the six major headings that LaFond gives in reflecting on how you might structure your rule of life. And vulnerability is something that we would clearly like to avoid discussing and like to avoid experiencing. And it is so much easier to put on a suit of armor to protect us, to pretend like we're not experiencing pain or suffering. It can be easier to hide behind our pride than it is to acknowledge our vulnerabilities. And honestly, our whole world is created to suggest to us that we can somehow magically avoid experiencing pain, that we can avoid suffering and grief and loss, that will never age, that we can somehow move closer to immortality. And we just know that that's not true, that suffering and grief are actually one of the things that bind us together in our human condition. Joy and love and happiness and suffering and grief and envy, our vulnerabilities, all of these things are things that we carry in common. And Thomas Merton actually suggests that we want so much to avoid experiencing suffering ourselves that we're willing to inflict suffering on others if we imagine that we can avoid experiencing it ourselves. But that is actually an illusion. There is no avoiding it. And so if we acknowledge and move to a place where we realize that we cannot avoid those things that highlight our vulnerabilities, is there a way instead to sit in ground that feels dusty and lifeless and realize that when God is invited into that space, when we take steps to heal, that dusty ground can be reimagined into soil that is rich and fertile and ready to be tilled and bring forth fruitfulness in our own lives. And though I hate to say it, I would love for it to not be true. But for me, I've actually never grown in a time where I've been feeling really comfortable. Growth for me has only happened when I've encountered tension or conflict or suffering and prayerfully moved through it, and coming out on the other side have felt the growth that God has brought forth from those places of tension and pain. And it's not to say that suffering is always virtuous or that suffering is heroic or that suffering somehow is the only thing that moves us closer to God. But it is to say that in our experience of suffering, when we invite God into that place, that suffering can be transformed. And there is new life that can come from places that have felt like death. And there is light that penetrates the darkness. And these chapters invite our reflection not only on what we do when we encounter these things, encouraging us to name it directly, to try to be faithful even in the midst of these experiences of suffering, but also how we can imagine what faithfulness looks like, remembering that the peace of God, that shalom, the peace of God, comes into the world as it is. The peace of God is found in the world as it is. And so amidst the chaos and amidst the suffering and amidst the uncertainty, how can we be grounded and anchored in a way that allows us to be attuned to God and to move closer to wholeness, recognizing that the image of God dwells within us and within each other through all of the things that we encounter in our life. So LaFond, under vulnerability, names suffering and fear and uncertainties and grief and loss and envy. And because these topics are so tender, he suggests that when you approach them to begin writing your own chapter on them, that it might be helpful to write words or phrases that come to mind, almost like a stream of consciousness or threads that can be pulled together later as you're pulling together complete thoughts. But as you begin to write, it's okay to just write the impulses that come to you. So if when you consider suffering, the weight of your own suffering is so large that you can't write a reflective chapter, it's okay to start where you are and write on what you have to offer in this moment. Sometimes we can treat suffering and loss and grief as though it's a sign of dysfunction or as though it's an aberration. And the truth is that it's just normal. But our world invites us to both ignore it or to turn to some means of self-anesthetization, some kind of way for us to tune it out, either through alcohol or food or medicine or online shopping. There's all kinds of ways that we might choose to try to ignore what's happening. But instead, we're invited to name what's happening, to name the sufferings and the griefs in our lives. And in naming them and confronting them, allowing ourselves to be open to the fact that they're not aberrations, and to contemplate what we need, what self-care looks like for us, so that we can move from a sense of lack of stability into a space of stability. Now, it has seemed to me that we only give generosity and compassion to others that we have learned to give to ourselves. And one of the hopes in confronting our own vulnerabilities and removing some of our own armor and peeling back some of those layers that perhaps we've put up to protect ourselves, that we can move from a space of pretending like those pains don't exist to a space of knowing that they do exist for us. And as we exercise compassion and generosity with ourselves, that we can become more empathetic and compassionate and generous when we encounter others, recognizing that though our griefs and sufferings may not be the same, that we all carry those griefs and sufferings. Our hope is that acknowledging it, acknowledging vulnerability, allows us to move from an unhealthy space where vulnerability can sometimes be life depleting or make us scared or make us feel small, and into a healthy space where being vulnerable is life giving. Being in relationship with one another requires that healthy vulnerability, that healthy willingness to be open and to name our true selves, our authentic selves, our genuine selves to one another. So the hope is that we can move into a space where vulnerability is actually a life-giving experience, that it invites us into that authenticity. So how do we walk through these spaces together? LaFond invites us to reject fear and to choose peacefulness. Well, LaFond also invites us to wonder whether our sense of fearfulness or a desire for security, our concern about uncertainty, actually keeps us from living the life that God has called us to live. There's a question about whether we're so concerned for security that we cannot actually let go of the edge of the pool and swim into the deeper waters that God is calling us to. Uncertainty is inherent in discernment, and it is very often that when we're called into discernment, we're authentically listening. But God will invite us into spaces that we may not want to go, that may feel scary. And there is a requirement in faithful living that we submit to God, and submission can just be terrifying. It can be much easier to imagine that there is a security or a certainty in the world that we've built up around ourselves than there is in submitting to God. But that security that we imagine for ourselves, that edge of the pool, it's often an illusion. And people encounter this all the time, but especially during this pandemic. The security that we've imagined for ourselves is often quite thin in reality. People lose their jobs all the time. People imagine that they have family units or friendships that may not actually hold up over the test of time. People imagine financial security that can disappear as quickly as a puff of smoke. This economy and this pandemic has really shown us that if we base our lives, if we imagine certainty and security in the way that our world has invited us to imagine it, that we're really holding on to an illusion. And there is an invitation to ask whether we're willing to be comfortable enough with uncertainty to go where God might be calling us to go. The truth is that faithful living requires that we submit to God alone. And that's part of what discernment and listening and attuning ourselves to God in our midst is calling us into. So that submission moves us from the illusion of security and certainty into a journey that will absolutely challenge and reshape us. But we cannot go on that journey if we don't let go of the edge of the pool and move from the shallow waters to the deeper waters. If shalom is in the world as God has made it, in the world as it is, not in the perfect world that we hope will come, but the peace of God is in our very midst. And that peace of God is available to us even in times of uncertainty and insecurity. That peace of God is real, and it is the only real source of peace. So, for me, in this particular section, one of the most important chapters is on grief and loss. And I think that's in part because we don't name our experiences of grief very often. So when we imagine that uncertainty, the uncertainty of our financial future, or the uncertainty of some relationships that we have depended on, or the uncertainty of our jobs or the world as we've known it, when one of those things slips away from us, there is a sense of real grief and real loss. And our world does not invite us to name those as griefs. So, for example, several years ago, when my husband was laid off, there was a real experience of grief for both of us. Him in terms of the effort and work he had put into a job that then abandoned him. He was loyal to the job and the job wasn't loyal to him. And for me, there was this sense of grief and both in financial insecurity and also in watching my husband go through something that really shook his sense of identity. So while people are aware of perhaps when someone is laid off, that sense of vulnerability that they might have in terms of financial insecurity, there's also that shaking of the sense of identity or of, am I enough? Was who I was in that space enough? And the grieving of the person that we thought we were, the identity that we thought we had, as it shifts and morphs into something else. We also don't name griefs as our bodies change as we either age or experience illness. We imagine, and our world is built around a sort of 20-year-old ideal, like that you can always be the way that you were at 20, or the way, if you're younger than that, the way you will be at 20. But the truth is that you're 20 for a year, and then you're not. And you're 30 for a year, and then you're not. And that's not unnatural. That is a natural progression of life. And as life progresses and as we experience different challenges, our bodies will change and sometimes our abilities will change. And there is a real absence of a space for naming that as a grief. But we act as though people should just be fine with the way that things change for them. And the truth is, there's grief, there's a sense of loss. I think that that's probably not unfamiliar to most of you. I have family members who are experiencing that right now, that when they go out to do the things that they used to do, they're aware of their vulnerabilities in a new way. And this pandemic has also highlighted this for them, that though they might not have identified themselves as at risk or vulnerable, that either because of a suppressed immune system or because of their age, they're listed as more vulnerable to COVID-19 than others are. And just naming that for some of them has been a source of real, they've been startled, and it's been a source of real grief. We are bearers of the image of God from birth through death. And there is nothing that changes the fact that we bear the image of God. That spark of divinity within us is not related to our productivity or our athleticism or our brilliance. The image of God dwells within us, and that's where our dignity comes from. And so as we mourn the loss of productivity or athleticism or brilliance, as we experience that loss, we might grieve that loss, but be still and dwell in the knowledge that you are made in the image of God, and that is the source of your dignity always. As we experience our own griefs and as we name them and are tender and gentle with ourselves, I hope that we can also be invited to reflect on how we can be tender and gentle with one another, remembering that we are often not encouraged to name these griefs. And so you may encounter someone who is experiencing a loss but doesn't have the language to articulate that or to try to deal with it in a healthy way. And so my hope is that in this chapter, you are invited into reflecting and articulating those things for yourself, and that the sense of self-care and self-value that you're invited into based on your dignity, your utter dignity and utter value that's imbued within you, that as you are invited into that space of self-care and acknowledging your self-worth, that we can also be gentle with one another when we encounter people who may not have been invited into those spaces of reflection yet. So in this section, LaFond also includes a chapter on envy, calling it a misplaced desire. And it's such an interesting thing. At first I thought envy included in vulnerability, that's interesting. But as I thought about it, I realized that when we're afraid or when we're suffering or when we're grieving, it is very easy to imagine that a material good can make it all better, or that if we had someone else's life, we could make it all better. Sometimes the images during this pandemic of celebrities quarantining in their homes by a pool with a lush garden, and it feels like, oh, well, it would be great to quarantine in that. That sounds like a vacation, not a quarantine. And so I've even found myself in a couple of moments envious of those people, of those pictures as they're lounging in what really looks like a scene from the Garden of Eden. But the truth is that you're called to be yourself, and most of us do not have access to little slices of the Garden of Eden. So we can imagine that if we had what someone else had, things would be easier and maybe we wouldn't suffer anymore. But that we know that that isn't true. And actually, one of the experiences that I had when I was reflecting on this is an experience that we had just moved for seminary. And it had taken all of our financial resources to make that move. And I started working at a church in Georgetown, and there was a drive to help somebody's children, and it was actually a very generous drive. And there was one person that wrote a check for $10,000. And I thought, oh my gosh, $10,000. If I had access to that money, how much easier my life would be. I would love to have access to that and to have that sense of security that would come from having just something in the account again. And so I had that thought, and I'll admit it wasn't just a thought, it was very envious. I was very envious of that financial security that would just allow you to write that check. And a couple of weeks later, that person called the church, and that person's sister had died, and that was it for family. There was no more family. And the grief that I heard in that call was overwhelming. And I thought to myself, all the money in the world, you can write a check for whatever amount you wanted to write a check for, and it doesn't matter because that's it. That's it. You've lost your sister. and there's no money that can bring her back. And it was humbling for me. And I was really, truly ashamed of how envious I had been. And it was an important lesson for me that actually those things that we envy in others, that we imagine would make life easier, or that we desire because we want to avoid suffering and we want to avoid insecurity, we don't know that those things, those material goods, don't resolve the issues that people experience when they experience suffering and grief. So the memory of that stays with me. I was very envious and then very ashamed because I had the gift of family, the blessing of family that this person no longer had. There's no amount of money that changes that. So when we imagine our own suffering and our own grief and our own sense of insecurity, and we imagine those material things that we think can plug those holes that can keep us from experiencing that pain or that tension, it's a more fruitful endeavor to imagine God in that space and how God can invite new life from spaces that have felt dusty and dry. How God can bring light into places that have been only places of darkness. So our chapters on vulnerability are meant to invite us from a mindless self-anesthetization or just outright ignoring the pain and conflict or tension or suffering in our lives into true mindfulness. It invites us to be aware of how God is calling us into new life, into new space, and how God longs to be with us in the midst of our pain, in the midst of our joy. God is always present. And these chapters are meant to invite us into that awareness and into deeper compassion and deeper empathy for ourselves and for others. So the question is not whether we will experience suffering and pain. The question is how we will experience suffering and pain. And my prayer for us is that when we encounter it, we name it. We seek out those resources that help us to care for ourselves, help us to heal, that we have open hearts, that we don't clench tight, but that we open our hearts, and that we're willing to face whatever it is that's happening with the knowledge that God wants our wholeness. God wants us to be in conversation with God about all of these things, that we're called to healing and to wholeness and to a life with mindfulness and intention. Amen. I look forward to seeing you in our next installment. Next week, we'll discuss body, and it will be an interesting conversation to have. I look forward to sharing it with you. And again, you are welcome to contact me if you would like to share any of your thoughts with Rule of Life, or if you want to discuss any struggles you're encountering with it. And I will be also hosting a Zoom hour on Tuesday evening. You're welcome to just pop in and chat about Rule of Life and how things are going for you. And I would be happy to see you and happy to answer any questions. And that Zoom link will be included in News You Can Use. So God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.